It was March 12th, 2024, a Tuesday, and my husband of 12 years was sitting across from me in a mediator's office. His attorney had just laid out the proposal, $800 a month in spousal support. That's what Derek thought I was worth after 12 years of marriage. He looked tired, no power tie, no big energy, just a guy who hadn't been sleeping. Then my attorney, Marcus Chen, big guy, former college wrestler, never subtle about anything, started placing documents on the table. Revenue figures, employee count, active commercial contracts, a formal business valuation report, $2.1 million in revenue, running through a facilities management company, filed under my maiden name. A company I'd built from my Honda's front seat, while Derek monitored every dollar I spent at Target. I watched his face. I'd prepared myself for the anger, for that vein in his forehead that showed up during arguments, for the jaw clench, for him to slam his hand on the table and call me a liar. That's not what happened. He stared at the documents for a long time. Then he looked up at me, not at Marcus, not at his attorney, at me. And in the quietest voice I'd heard from him in years, he said, "You filed it under your maiden name." That wasn't even the hardest part of this story. But let me start from the beginning. Before I get into the full story, if you're into stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe. We drop new ones every single day. I need to be honest about something upfront. This isn't one of those stories where I win perfectly and walk away clean. This story doesn't have a hero. And honestly, by the end, I'm not even sure who the villain is. I'm posting this from a throwaway because my divorce was finalized about 6 weeks ago, and my attorney specifically told me not to post anything until the ink was dry. Well, the ink is dry, and I have a story, though probably not the one you're expecting. I met Derek at a 4th of July barbecue in Plano, Texas back in 2011. He was 26, I was 23, and okay, I know everyone says this, but he wasn't always like this. The first 4 years of our marriage, Derek was genuinely good to me. He'd leave notes in my lunch bag when I was still working. He cried when Lily was born in the spring of 2014, just stood there holding her, tears running down his face, saying, "We made this." When I said I wanted to stay home with the baby, he didn't push back. He said, "Let's make it work." We'd been making about $115,000 combined. His salary at the commercial insurance firm, plus my $42,000 as an office manager at a logistics company in Richardson. Daycare was running $1,800 a month, so the math checked out. And for a while, it really did work. Our second daughter, Sophie, came in 2016. Things were tight but stable. Derek was grinding toward a regional VP position at his firm. He'd been told he was on track, just needed to put in the years. He worked late. I held down the house. We were tired, but we were a team. Or at least, I thought we were. Then 2019 happened. Derek got passed over for the VP job, the position he'd been working toward for 5 years. They gave it to Ryan Ostrowski, a guy Derek had personally trained, a guy 3 years younger, a guy who'd been at the firm half as long. Derek came home that night and sat in his truck in the driveway for 45 minutes before he came inside. I watched him through the kitchen window. He never told me what happened. I found out from his coworker's wife at a school function 2 weeks later. Something hardened in him after that. It wasn't overnight. It was gradual, like watching concrete set. He'd always been careful with money, but it shifted from careful to controlling. I had a debit card linked to a joint checking account, and suddenly if I spent more than $150 without texting him first, I'd get a 20-minute lecture about fiscal responsibility. He started checking the account every night before bed, scrolling through transactions on his phone. He'd question charges from 3 days ago. $41 at Kroger. What you buy? Like I was submitting expense reports to a manager. This is a man who bought a $47,000 F-150 Platinum. The black one with the leather interior. I remember it pulling into the driveway like it was yesterday, 2 months after losing that promotion. A $6,000 Breitling watch he kept in his office desk drawer so I wouldn't see it. A $12,000 bass boat that sat in his buddy Craig's driveway because we didn't have room for it. All of it financed, all of it hidden. But sure, Derek, lecture me about the $38 I spent at Target on socks for our children. The comments started around the same time. Not jokes at dinner parties, That would have been easier to name. It was quieter than that. We'd be talking to another couple at a school event, and the wife would mention her job, and Derek would put his arm around me and say, "I keep telling her she should get back out there, but," and trail off with this little shrug, like I was a project he'd given up on. Or we'd be at his sister Brenda's house, and someone would mention the economy, and he'd glance at me and say, "Well, some of us don't have to worry about that." Always with this half smile, like he was including me in the joke. But I was the joke. The one that stuck with me the most wasn't even the cruelest. It was a Saturday morning, October 2021, I think, because Sophie had just started kindergarten the month before. I was standing at the kitchen counter going over my week's schedule in my head, because by then I had a lot to schedule, though he didn't know that, and he walked past me, poured his coffee, and said, almost to himself, "I wonder what it's like to not have anything you have to figure out." He wasn't trying to be mean. That's what made it worse. He genuinely believed it. He looked at me and saw nothing happening. Nothing at all. When someone makes you invisible for long enough, you go one of two ways. You either actually disappear, or you start building something so real they can't look through you anymore. I somehow managed to do both at the same time, which I still don't fully understand how that works. But I did. In late 2020, my neighbor Janet was drowning. She managed a portfolio of 11 rental properties for an investment group out of Houston, and COVID had wrecked everything. 3 of her regular contractors had folded. She couldn't get a plumber to return a call. She had turnover on 4 units happening simultaneously and no one to coordinate the painters, the cleaners, the carpet guys, the appliance installers. She was working 18-hour days and still falling behind. I mentioned I used to work in logistics. She stared at me like I'd told her I could fly. You know how to manage vendors and timelines. I told her I'd coordinated fleet scheduling and warehouse turnover for a company that moved $6 million in freight a month. She said, "I will pay you whatever you want." I took over vendor coordination for all 11 properties. I did it from my phone while Sophie napped and Lily was at school. Within 3 weeks, I had her turnover time down from 12 days to 4. I was negotiating rates with contractors, scheduling inspections, tracking punch lists, and handling tenant move-in walkthroughs. Janet told her investment group what I'd done, and their COO called me directly. He said, "We have 63 units across 4 complexes. Can you do what you did for Janet?" That's when I made the decision that I'm still not sure was brave or just reckless. Probably both. I incorporated DFW Facility Partners, LLC, filed under my maiden name, new bank account at Greater Texas Federal Credit Union, a branch in McKinney that Derek would never set foot in, got a general liability policy and professional indemnity insurance through a broker in Fort Worth. And by June 2021, I had my first real contract, coordinating all maintenance, turnover, and vendor management for those 63 units at a flat monthly rate. Everything ran through a P.O. box I rented for $19 a month. I was meticulous, borderline paranoid, honestly, but I had this feeling, even then, that I might need this someday. What I didn't understand was that meticulous and legally defensible aren't the same thing. I'll come back to that. Here's what nobody, including Derek, bothered to remember. I had 7 years of logistics operations experience that I'd never been allowed to talk about because it didn't fit the narrative Derek had built around me. I knew how to manage vendor networks, negotiate service contracts, build scheduling systems, and track deliverables across multiple sites simultaneously. I'd done it professionally before Lily was born. Now I was doing it from a laptop I kept locked in the trunk of my Honda. By mid-2022, I had 4 full-time coordinators working under me, and we'd expanded beyond residential property management into commercial facilities, office buildings, medical clinics, a chain of dental offices across Collin County that needed a single point of contact for everything from HVAC maintenance to after-hours janitorial to parking lot resurfacing. Revenue was hitting $50,000 a month. I was managing operations, payroll, contractor vetting, and client acquisition from my phone and that trunk laptop, working during school hours and after Derek fell asleep. Then August 2022 almost killed the whole thing. An electrical contractor I'd vetted and scheduled for a medical clinic refit in Frisco cut corners on the panel work. 2 weeks after the job was signed off, a fault in the wiring started a small fire in the ceiling plenum after hours. No one was hurt. The sprinkler system caught it. But the clinic was shut down for 11 days pending electrical reinspection and water damage remediation. The practice lost an estimated $92,000 in revenue during the closure. Their attorney sent me a demand letter for the full amount, plus consequential damages. My contractor's insurance covered the electrical work itself, but my company had coordinated and approved the vendor. My professional indemnity policy had a $15,000 deductible and a coverage question around whether my vendor approval process constituted an implied warranty of workmanship. My insurance company's adjuster told me the claim might be denied entirely. I sat in the parking lot of a Walmart on Preston Road. It was maybe 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. The lot was almost empty, just me and some guy loading mulch into a pickup. And I went through every vendor contract I'd ever signed, looking for the gap in my vetting process that had let this happen. I found it. I'd been checking licenses and insurance certificates, but not pulling permit histories or violation records from the state licensing board. A 20-minute search would have shown me that this contractor had 2 prior code violations in Denton County. I almost called Derek, almost told him everything right then. Not because I thought he'd help. I'd stopped believing that by then, but because I was so tired of carrying it alone. I know that sounds dramatic, but building something this complicated and not being able to tell anyone, it messes with your head. Some nights I'd lie in bed next to him after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, and I'd think, I have 19 people depending on me, and I can't tell a single person in my actual life. Then I remembered what he'd said the night before. I'd been on my phone answering an urgent email from a property manager. He didn't know that, of course, and he'd glanced over and said, "Must be nice, having nothing so important it can't wait until morning." So, yeah, I didn't call him. I negotiated the clinic claim down to $31,000, 15 from insurance, 16 from the business account. I rebuilt our entire vendor vetting protocol from scratch. I added state licensing board checks, pulled permit histories going back 5 years, required 3 commercial references for any contractor over a $5,000 job threshold. And I kept going. But that whole thing changed me in ways I didn't see at the time. It made me more secretive, not less. I tightened every operational detail. I opened a second business account at a different credit union. I started using a separate phone, a prepaid I kept in my glove box for all business calls. I told myself I was being smart. I was actually building the case against myself, which, looking back, is almost funny. Almost. By early 2023, I had 8 full-time employees and a network of 46 vetted contractors. Revenue was hitting $70,000 a month. By September 2023, I'd landed the contract that changed the math entirely. A facilities management agreement with a commercial real estate group that operated 38 buildings across the DFW Metroplex. I would coordinate all maintenance, emergency repairs, and capital improvement projects across their entire portfolio. That single contract was worth $26,000 a month. Between that and everything else, I crossed $89,000 in a single month. Let me put that in context. Derek was making about $9,600 a month before taxes. I was making more than 9 times that, and he had absolutely no idea. He'd come home, toss his keys on the counter, and look at me with that expression. Not mean exactly, just closed. Like he'd already decided what the answer was before he asked. And I'd tell him about laundry and Sophie's math homework and the chicken thing he liked. This garlic butter recipe I'd found on Pinterest years ago. He asked for it every week. Meanwhile, I had 4 coordinators scheduling jobs across 43 properties, a bookkeeper named Renata who'd become my operational right hand, and a contractor network that was becoming the largest independent vendor management platform in Collin County. I want to be honest about something here, because this is the part I've been avoiding. I didn't just hide the business because I was afraid of Derek. At first, yes, but by 2023, there was something else. Power. For the first time in my marriage, I knew something he didn't. I had something that was entirely mine. And there was a part of me, not a small part, that enjoyed it, enjoyed watching him lecture me about fiscal responsibility, while I had $700,000 flowing through accounts he'd never seen. That's not self-defense. That's something else entirely, something I'm not proud of. I'm still sitting with that. In February 2024, Derek sat me down at the kitchen table, the one I'd picked out at Nebraska Furniture Mart, the one he told everyone he chose, and told me he wanted a divorce. And here's where the story probably stops being what you expect. He didn't give me some arrogant speech about outgrowing me. He was quiet. He looked tired. He said, "I don't think we make each other better anymore. I don't think we have in a long time." He said he'd already talked to a lawyer and wanted to be fair. His version of fair: he'd keep the house. I'd get the 2019 Honda CR-V. He'd pay me $800 a month in spousal support for 3 years. $800 a month. He wasn't trying to insult me. That's the part that's hard to explain. He genuinely believed that was reasonable, because he genuinely believed I had nothing. No skills, no income, no prospects. He'd spent 5 years looking at me and seeing someone who needed to be taken care of, and the number reflected exactly what he saw. The insult wasn't the number. It was that he'd looked at me every day for 5 years and genuinely saw someone worth $800 a month. That's it. That's what he came up with. I told him I needed time to think about it. What I actually needed was time to prepare. I hired Marcus Chen, family law attorney, 19 years of practice in Dallas County. Big guy, former college wrestler, talks too fast and leaves voicemails that are 7 minutes long. The kind of lawyer who makes you uncomfortable because he tells you exactly what you don't want to hear and doesn't care if you cry about it. He took one look at my business records, 3 years of tax returns, bank statements, payroll reports, commercial contracts, and leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, you built a hell of a company, and you also built yourself one hell of a problem." Here's what Marcus explained to me, and it was not what I wanted to hear. In Texas, any income earned during a marriage is community property. It doesn't matter that I filed under my maiden name. It doesn't matter that Derek didn't know about it. Legally, my business, or at least a significant portion of its value, belonged to both of us. By hiding it, I had done essentially the same thing I was furious at Derek for doing. I had concealed marital assets. You're going to sit across from a judge and explain why you opened accounts at credit unions 20 miles away, used a P.O. box, filed under your maiden name, and bought a burner phone, Marcus said. And the judge is going to decide whether that was a frightened woman protecting herself or a savvy business owner hiding assets from her spouse. It could go either way. We need to make sure it goes the right way. My stomach just, I don't know, dropped. I'd spent 3 years feeling righteous about my secret, proud of it even. And now, my own attorney was telling me it could blow up in my face. Then things got worse. 2 weeks before mediation, Renata, my operations manager, the person who kept the daily machinery of my business running, told me she'd gotten an offer from Build Ops, a national facilities management platform. They were offering her $120,000 a year plus equity, almost double what I was paying her. She said she didn't want to leave, but she had 2 kids and the offer was life-changing. I couldn't blame her. I also couldn't lose her. 3 of my 5 biggest contracts had 30-day termination clauses, and every one of those clients had a direct relationship with Renata. If she left, those contracts would follow her out the door within 60 days. So now I was heading into a divorce where I needed my business to be worth as much as possible for my own negotiating position, while simultaneously watching the human infrastructure of that business threaten to walk out. Marcus actually laughed when I told him. "This," he said, "is what we in the legal profession call a real mess." I offered Renata a 15% equity stake in the company. It was the right call for the business. She stayed, but that stake would later become a complication in the valuation that I did not see coming. Marcus brought in a financial analyst to do a proper valuation. Total revenue over 3 years, $2.1 million. Net profit after expenses, payroll, insurance, and taxes, about $740,000. Current appraised value of the company as a going concern, accounting for the Renata equity carve-out and the 30-day termination clauses, was roughly $890,000. Those numbers were real, but so was my legal exposure. And so were the fragility points that Derek's attorney was about to find. Meanwhile, Marcus dug into Derek's finances, and what he found was the other half of the story. Derek had racked up $141,000 in credit card debt across 4 cards I had never seen. But here's the part that messed with my head in a way I was not prepared for. It wasn't all selfish spending. Yes, there was the truck, the watch, the bass boat at Craig's, a membership at Stonebriar Country Club. But there were also charges I hadn't expected. A therapist he'd been seeing twice a month since 2020. He'd never told me. Payments to his mother's assisted living facility that he'd been covering since 2021 without saying a word. A community college tuition payment for his nephew Tyler, whose parents couldn't afford it. He was spending money he didn't have. Some of it on vanity, some of it on pride, and some of it on people he loved. The same way I'd been building something in secret, partly out of survival, partly out of spite, and partly because I was genuinely good at it. Neither of us could see the other clearly anymore. We were both performing different versions of strength for different audiences, and lying to each other to keep it up. The stupid thing is, we were basically doing the same thing from opposite ends of the house. I just couldn't see it then. And that brings us to the moment I told you about at the start, the mediation. March 12th, Derek showed up looking like he hadn't slept in days. His attorney laid out the same $800 a month, then looked at Marcus like he expected a counter. Marcus put everything on the table because, as he'd told me the day before, concealment only works until it doesn't, and we are well past doesn't. Derek's face went through something I wasn't prepared for. Not the anger I'd expected, not the rage, just that quiet question about my maiden name. Like the money was abstract, but the name meant I'd already left the marriage years before I'd admitted it. Sitting there across from him, I realized he was right about that. I had. His attorney recovered faster than Derek did, asked for a recess. When they came back, the posture had changed completely. Now they wanted half the business. Community property, built during the marriage, deliberately concealed for 3 years. They also zeroed in on the Renata equity stake, arguing I diluted Derek's community property share by giving away 15% of the business without his knowledge or consent, 2 weeks before mediation, and that the timing looked like a deliberate attempt to reduce the asset value. Marcus had warned me this might happen. He'd told me to wait. I hadn't listened, and here's the part that ate at me for weeks afterward. On the equity stake, they had a point. The case went before Judge Hernandez 3 months later because we couldn't reach an agreement in mediation. Derek's attorney hammered the concealment angle and the Renata equity issue. My business was built with marital time and resources. I'd hidden it deliberately, filed under my maiden name, used a P.O. box, opened accounts at credit unions across the Metroplex, bought a prepaid phone specifically for business calls. These weren't the actions of someone who forgot to mention a side project. These were the actions of someone deliberately hiding assets from their spouse. And then, facing divorce, I'd carved out 15% of the company's equity and handed it to an employee, reducing what the community estate could claim. The timing, he said, spoke for itself. Marcus argued the other side. Derek had been financially controlling for years. He monitored every purchase I made. He diminished me publicly and privately. The concealment was a response to an environment where financial disclosure felt impossible, not a calculated fraud. He presented Derek's own hidden credit card debt, $141,000 in undisclosed liabilities, accumulated during the same years he was monitoring my every purchase. He argued that the Renata equity stake was a legitimate business decision made to retain a key employee during a crisis. That without it, the company's value would have collapsed, and the community estate would have received nothing instead of something. Judge Hernandez was not amused by either of us. She said so directly. Here's what the judge ordered, and I want to be completely honest. I did not get the clean victory I had imagined during all those late nights in my Honda's front seat, answering emails on a burner phone, while my actual phone sat on the kitchen counter playing the role of a woman who had nothing going on. I got the house. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, worth about $412,000 on the current market. I got primary custody of both girls. Derek got every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. He pays $2,200 a month in child support. But the business, the judge ruled that 60% of the company value constituted community property because I built it during the marriage using marital time. The remaining 40% was credited to what she called my separate entrepreneurial initiative and professional expertise. She upheld the Renata equity stake as a legitimate retention decision, but noted that the timing was concerning and factored it into the overall distribution. Derek was awarded 30% of the total business equity, roughly $267,000, to be paid in a structured buyout over 36 months. So every month for the next 3 years, I write a check for $7,417 to the man who thought I had no skills, no income, and no future. Let that sit with you for a second. The judge sanctioned Derek $9,000 for failing to disclose his credit card debt during discovery. She noted in her ruling that his pattern of financial control and diminishment was a significant factor in the custody determination. But she also noted, and I have the transcript, that my deliberate and sophisticated concealment of substantial marital assets over a multi-year period was deeply troubling, and that the circumstances of the marriage were the primary reason the consequences weren't significantly more severe. She called us both out for what she described as a parallel pattern of financial dishonesty that corroded the marriage from both sides. I walked out of that courtroom, and I didn't feel like I'd won. Didn't feel like I'd lost either. I felt seen, maybe, for the first time, and not all of it was pretty. That was about 5 months ago. Here's where everybody is now. Derek moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Garland, not a 1-bedroom, because he needed space for the girls on his weekends. He kept his insurance job. Lily told me last week that he's been packing his lunch every day now instead of going out, and she said it like it was just a funny little observation, not understanding what it meant. Sophie mentioned that he's been reading to her before bed on his weekends, something he rarely did when we were all under one roof. I don't know what to do with that information. The man my daughters are getting on alternating weekends seems like someone I might have actually liked if I'd met him now. I try not to think about that too much. Here's the part nobody warns you about when you get what you want. My daughters now split their lives between 2 homes. Sophie asked me last month if the divorce was her fault, and I held it together just long enough to say the right things before I fell apart in the shower at midnight. Lily is angry in this quiet, 11-year-old way, where she won't talk about it, but she slams every cabinet door in the kitchen. Those aren't costs that show up in any settlement paperwork. No valuation report captures that. Me, I'm sitting in my home office right now, the room he used to call the junk room like it was a punchline, running a company with 22 employees, 46 vetted contractors, and 8 active commercial contracts. Revenue last year hit $430,000. I built this business from a neighbor's desperate phone call and 7 years of logistics experience that my husband never thought to ask about. And I'm still finding vendor management problems to solve at 2 in the morning because the work doesn't care what time it is. I write that check to Derek every month, $7,417, 29 more payments to go. Some days it feels like the cost of freedom. Some days it feels like a reminder that I wasn't as different from him as I thought. Most days it just feels like both. I started mentoring 2 women through a small business incubator in McKinney. One of them, Diane, landed her first commercial facilities contract last month, coordinating maintenance for a medical office in Frisco. She called me shaking, and I sat in my car and cried too, because I remembered exactly what that first real contract felt like. When the revenue is yours, when you built the system yourself, when nobody can tell you it doesn't count. I spent 12 years in a marriage where I slowly became invisible, where the logistics experience I'd built before motherhood was treated as irrelevant, where every dollar I spent was monitored, but every contribution I made was ignored. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I built something real in the hours between school pickups and dinner, managing contractors from parking lots, keeping a laptop locked in my trunk and a burner phone in my glove box because I had nowhere else to put them. $800 a month. That's what Derek thought I was worth. The truth is messier than any number. I was worth more than he ever saw, and I hid it from him, and we both told lies in that marriage that cost us more than money. He hid his debt and his therapist and his mother's care bills. I hid my company and my ambition, and eventually my contempt. We were 2 people keeping secrets in the same house, convinced the other one was the problem. But I'd rather be here, writing that monthly check, running my company, holding my daughters on the nights they need me, knowing I wasn't perfect in this than where I was, disappearing by inches, being treated like a line item on someone else's budget, watching myself turn into whoever he decided I was. So here's my question, and I don't want the easy version. Has anyone ever been in a situation where you finally proved someone wrong, and in the process discovered you weren't entirely right either, where the win was real, but it looked different once you actually had it in your hands? Tell me in the comments. I want the real answers, not the fairy tales.